This is lecture 19 for History 2111. The last time we met, we talked a bit about the emerging two-party system in the early republic. Today I want to talk about the election of 1800. This election is significant because it demonstrates the establishment and lasting establishment of the two-party system. The founders, as I said before, did not anticipate the emergence of political parties. So they set up the Electoral College, whereby the candidate who received the most votes would be president. The candidate who received the second number of votes would be vice president. Now, not anticipating the emergence of political parties, it did not occur to the founders or to the writers of the Constitution that you could potentially have a president and a vice president in opposition to each other. But that's exactly what's going to emerge here. Now, you'll recall that George Washington served 2 terms as our first president and then took his retirement to Mount Vernon, establishing a precedent, which may be the most valuable thing that Washington ever did, walking away voluntarily from power. His vice president, John Adams, our attorney from Boston, became president in 1796. Now, the former Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, received a substantial number of votes in 1796 from the Electoral College. And you can look at the maps here that we've provided for you. The electoral map. Take a look at this election in 1796. You see that Adams carries all of New England, including New York State and some of the mid-Atlantic states. Jefferson, on the other hand, carries the South for the most part, and his electoral power extending all the way up to Pennsylvania. Now, you can't help but empathize with Jefferson looking at these results and seeing how close the results are. You can't help but put yourself in Jefferson's shoes and begin to ask, what would it take to elect me as President of the United States? Having come so close in 1796, Jefferson looks at the electoral map here and sees that should the state of New York switch its allegiance from the Federalist to the Anti-Federalist, then Thomas Jefferson could become President of the United States. So I want you to keep this in mind. Now, John Adams serves 1 term as president, and it is a tumultuous 4 years. There is Adams, in deference to Washington, kept many of Washington's cabinet officers. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was not in the government officially, but he was very powerful and active behind the scenes, generally working against the policies of President Adams. So Adams was somewhat hamstrung by this arrangement whereby his own cabinet tended to be against him. During Adams's presidency, we also have a threatening war with France. Again, remember that the French Revolution is taking place in Europe, so the Adams administration takes place, if you want to look at a broader Atlantic context, in the shadow of this revolution in France, and of course the ongoing wars of the French Revolution between France and England. So war threatens with France due to the American interest in its own neutrality and its right to trade with whomever it wants. Of course, the French don't see it this way. The French see American trade with the British as aiding their enemy. So this will very nearly take us to war with France. Adams will show a great deal of forbearance and patience and will manage to avoid this conflict, which the United States could barely afford and certainly could not match the power of France. But it tended to create division in the country, tended to divide the American people. Many Americans felt that the United States had been humiliated by France and had been treated as a second-rate power, which of course we were at that time. So we give some credit here for Adams for avoiding war, a war that Alexander Hamilton would very much have enjoyed, having maneuvered himself to the ranking general of the American Army. Now, during the Adams administration, this tension, born of the French Revolution and the American people's reaction to it, the divided reaction, is going to lead to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are designed to both limit the influence, the bad influence of the French Revolution on the United States, and to suppress domestic dissent. This, of course, tends to violate the First Amendment, and further divides the Federalist from the Anti-Federalist. For Jefferson and the Anti-Federalist, the Alien and Sedition Acts look very much like the program of a tyrannical government, power being held in the hands of a few and oppressing the rest of the population. So this is a very tumultuous time in American political history, diplomatic history, and Adams is at the forefront of this. So you can see the election of 1800, the two men who vied for power in 1896 are going to go at it again, Adams and Jefferson. Look at the difference here. Adams continues to carry the electoral votes of most of New England and some of the mid-Atlantic states, and even a few votes in North Carolina. But look what's happened. Jefferson has held on to the votes that he had earlier for the most part, but he's added New York State to the Anti-Federalist column. This is decisive, or at least important, because of the deal that Thomas Jefferson made with one of New York State's most powerful politicians, Aaron Burr. Now, we mentioned Burr when we talked about the Founding Fathers. I mentioned that Burr was a little different in that he was a true blue blood of American colonial society, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, the son of the president of New Jersey College, or what would later become Princeton. Burr was one of the youngest of the founders. He was a hero in the American Revolution. He was an attorney, worked in New York City, close by with Alexander Hamilton. They were both about the same age, both attorneys, both very skilled. Although ostensibly friendly, even working cases together at times, there was an emerging competition between these two. Sometimes you get the sense that Manhattan was not big enough for both Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. And of course, in due time, Burr would kill Hamilton in a duel, which we'll talk about later. But notice here in the election of 1800 that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr create a political alliance. And Burr worked very hard and very skillfully to bring New York State in line with the Anti-Federalist. And indeed, the election of 1800, the Anti-Federalists win. So the incumbent, John Adams, serves only the one term and will now retire to Massachusetts. There's something else here worth considering, though. This election is unusual in that Jefferson receives 73 electoral votes. Aaron Burr, his running mate, also receives 73 electoral votes. John Adams, the incumbent president, receives, I think it's like 65. I don't remember the exact number. But we have two politicians with the same number of votes. How are we going to resolve this problem? Everyone knew that the ticket of Jefferson and Burr, it was meant that Jefferson would be president and that Burr would be vice president. But here we have both men with the same number of electoral votes. This election goes into the House of Representatives now, and the debate goes on and on and on about how to resolve this problem. Now, oddly enough, probably the key figure in settling this electoral dispute is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, had been at odds with Jefferson from the very beginning, as we've talked about earlier. Jefferson and Hamilton's views on virtually everything are in opposition to each other. Yet, Hamilton persuades the Federalists in the House of Representatives to cast their vote for Thomas Jefferson as opposed to Aaron Burr, thus allowing Jefferson to become president as it was meant to be, and Burr vice president. Now, this election is interesting because, number one, it establishes the enduring two-party system in the United States, and this is a complicated historical question as well. We'll see the two-party system wane in the early 1800s under James Monroe, and then we'll see it reemerge again in the 1820s with Andrew Jackson, but that's a later story. What we have here is the full-blown emergence of a two-party system and a constitutional problem. How do we prevent a president and a vice president from having the same number of votes? So the 12th Amendment is put into effect, whereby candidates are designated for political parties, and there's a distinct designation for president and vice president. You can see here that this is a perfect illustration of how the founders did not anticipate political parties. They did not anticipate this type of problem emerging. So another result of this election of 1800 is that it begins to lay the foundation for a lasting bitterness and hostility between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Burr knows full well that Hamilton has used his influence to persuade the Federalists to cast their votes for Jefferson, although Hamilton and Jefferson had been political enemies since the 1889. Now, I mentioned earlier that Burr and Hamilton, similar in age, both attorneys, both living in Manhattan, ostensibly friends, yet there's an emerging jealousy and bitterness between these two men. Like I said earlier, it's almost as if New York cannot handle the ego and the political talent of two such men. And of course, one of them will be shortly eliminated, in fact, in 1804. So the election of 1800 is decisive for all these reasons. We'll talk about the culture of honor, about the Burr and Hamilton conflict and the duel in our next discussion, and we'll touch briefly on the Jeffersonian or Jefferson's administration. We'll talk about Lewis and Clark and Jefferson's embargo during the French Revolution. Thank you.